Chapter 1. Was it the ghost? It was the evening when Monsieur Debienne and Monsieur Poligny, the outgoing managers of the Paris Opera, gave their last gala performance on the occasion of their departure. The dressing room of La Sorelli, one of the leading ballerinas, was suddenly invaded by half a dozen members of the corps de ballet who had just left the stage after dancing Palliutes. They rushed into the room in great confusion, some laughing wildly, others uttering cries of terror. Wanting to be alone for a few minutes to rehearse the speech she would soon give before Debienne and Poligny in the lounge, La Sorelli had been irritated at seeing that throng of overwrought young women come in behind her. She turned to them and asked the reason for their agitation. Little Jammes explained it in 3 words, her voice choked and quavering with anxiety. "It's the ghost!" and she locked the door. La Sorelli was very superstitious. When she heard little Jammes mention the ghost, she shuddered and said, "You little fool!" And since she was the first to believe in ghosts in general, and in the opera ghost in particular, she wanted more information. "Did you see him?" she asked. "As plainly as I see you," little Jammes answered with a moan. Her legs buckled and she let herself fall into a chair. And little Giry immediately said, "If that was the ghost, he is really ugly." "Oh yes," the other dancers exclaimed in unison, and they all talked at once. The ghost had appeared to them in the guise of a gentleman in a black swallow-tailed coat who suddenly stood before them in the hall, without anyone's having seen where he came from. He had appeared so abruptly that it was as he had come out of the wall. "Oh, you see ghosts everywhere," said one of the dancers, who had more or less kept a cool head. And it was true that for several months everyone in the opera had been talking about that ghost in evening dress. He moved all through the building like a shadow, spoke to no one, and no one dared speak to him, and vanished as soon as he was seen, so quickly that no one could say how he did it or where he had gone. At first everyone had laughed and joked about that phantom dressed as a man about town or an undertaker, but his legend soon took on colossal proportions within the corps de ballet. The dancers all claimed to have met him in one way or another, and to have been victims of his evil spells, and those who laughed the loudest were not the least apprehensive. When he did not let himself be seen, he indicated his presence by comical happenings for which he was held responsible. An accident, a lost powder puff, a practical joke played on a dancer by one of her friends, it was all the fault of the ghost, the phantom of the opera. Actually, who had seen him? At the opera, there are not so many men in black swallow-tailed coats who are not ghosts, but this black swallow-tailed coat differed from others in one respect. It was worn by a skeleton, or at least that was what the dancers said, and the skeleton, of course, had a death's head. Did all this deserve to be taken seriously? The truth is that the idea of a skeleton arose from a description of the ghost given by Joseph Bouquet, the chief stagehand, who had really seen him. He had come face to face with him on the little staircase that begins near the footlights and goes down to the cellars. He had seen him for only a second before the ghost hurried away, but that second had made an indelible impression on him. And here is what Joseph Bouquet said about the ghost to anyone willing to listen. "He's incredibly thin. His black coat hangs loosely on his bony body. His eyes stare straight ahead without moving, and they're so deep set that you can hardly see them. All you really see is 2 dark holes, like the ones in a skull. His skin is tight as a drum. It's not white, but an ugly yellow. His nose is so small you can't see it when you look at him from the side. And that absence of a nose is something horrible to see. The only hair he has is 3 or 4 long dark locks that hang down over his forehead and behind his ears. This chief stagehand was a serious, steady man with a slow imagination, and he was sober. His words were listened to with astonishment and interest. At first, sensible people who heard Joseph Bouquet's story said he had been the victim of a practical joke by one of his subordinates. Then, one after another, came incidents so curious and inexplicable that even the shrewdest skeptics were shaken. A fireman is brave. He fears nothing, and certainly not fire. The fireman in question, a lieutenant, went to make a tour of inspection in the cellars and, it seems, ventured a little further than usual. He suddenly reappeared in the auditorium, pale, trembling, and bewildered, and he nearly fainted in the arms of little Jean's noble mother. And why? Because he had seen a head of fire, without a body, coming toward him at eye level. And I repeat, a fireman is not afraid of fire. This fireman's name was Papin. The corps de ballet was in consternation. First of all, that head of fire did not at all match the description of the ghost given by Joseph Bouquet. The fireman was carefully questioned, and Joseph Bouquet was questioned once again. The dancers were then convinced that the ghost had several heads, and changed them at will. They naturally imagined that they were in grave danger, since a fireman, and a lieutenant at that, had not hesitated to faint. The ballerinas and student dancers found ample excuses for the terror that made them run as fast as their legs could carry them whenever they had to pass by a patch of darkness in a dimly lighted hall. And so, on the day after the fireman had told his story, La Sorelli decided to give as much protection as possible to the building that had come under such an evil spell. Surrounded by all the dancers, she went to the doorkeeper's vestibule and put a horseshoe on the table there. Everyone, other than spectators who came into the opera, was expected to touch that horseshoe before starting up the stairs. Anyone who failed to do so would risk becoming a victim of the dark power that had taken possession of the building, from the cellars to the attic. All this will give some idea of the dancers' state of mind when they went to La Sorelli's dressing room. It was the ghost, little Jean's had exclaimed, and the dancers' anxiety had increased still more. Now there was an agonizing silence in the room, broken only by the sound of rapid breathing. Finally, showing genuine fear, Jean's ran to the farthest corner and murmured a single word. Listen. It seemed to everyone that a rustling sound was coming from the other side of the door. No footsteps. It was as if light silk cloth were sliding across the door. Then there was nothing. La Sorelli tried to be less faint-hearted than her companions. She went to the door and asked in a toneless voice, "Who's there?" But no one answered. Feeling all eyes watching her slightest movements, she forced herself to be brave and asked very loudly, "Is there someone out there in the hall?" "Oh, yes, of course there is," said the swarthy little Meg Geary, heroically holding La Sorelli by her gauze skirt. "Don't open the door. My God, don't open it." But La Sorelli, armed with the stiletto that was always with her, dared to unlock the door and open it while the dancers retreated into the bathroom, and Meg Geary gasped, "Mama! Mama!" La Sorelli courageously looked out into the hall. It was empty. A gaslight cast a grim red glow into the surrounding shadows without succeeding in dissipating them. With a heavy sigh, La Sorelli quickly closed the door again. "No," she said, "there's no one there." "But we saw him," Jean insisted. "He must be prowling around here somewhere. I'm not going back to get dressed. We should all go down to the lounge together right now for the speech and come back up together." "You must get a grip on yourselves, girls," La Sorelli said to the little dancers. The ghost? Maybe no one has ever seen him. We saw him, one of the girls protested, with his black coat and his death's head, the way he was when Joseph Bouquet saw him. And Gabriel saw him too, only yesterday, said James. Yesterday afternoon, in broad daylight. Gabriel, the chorus master? Of course. You mean you didn't know about it? And he was in evening dress, in broad daylight? Who? Gabriel? No, the ghost. That's right. He was in evening dress, said James. Gabriel told me so himself. That's how he recognized him. In fact, here's how it happened. Gabriel was in the stage manager's office. All at once the door opened and the Persian came in. You know, the Persian has the evil eye. Oh yes, the little dancers all exclaimed together. And you know how superstitious Gabriel is, James went on. He's polite, though, and usually when he sees the Persian, he just puts his hand in his pocket and touches his keys. But this time, it was different. As soon as he saw the Persian come in, he jumped up from his chair and ran to the lock on the closet door to touch iron. When he did that, he caught his coat on a nail and made a big rip in it. And he was in such a hurry to leave that he banged into a hat peg and gave himself a huge lump on the forehead. Then he quickly stepped backward and scraped his arm on the folding screen by the piano. He tried to lean on the piano, but he didn't watch what he was doing, and the keyboard cover fell down hard on his fingers. He dashed out of the office like a madman, stumbled on the stairs, and slid all the way down on his back. My mother and I were passing by just then. We hurried to help him stand up. We were scared when we saw how he looked. He was battered and bruised, and there was blood all over his face. But he smiled at us and said, "Thank God, I got off with so little damage." Then we questioned him, and he told us why he'd been afraid. It was because he'd seen the ghost behind the Persian, the ghost with the death's head, the way Joseph Bouquet described him. This story was greeted by a frightened murmur, followed by another silence, during which La Sorelli feverishly polished her fingernails. "Joseph Bouquet should keep quiet," Meg Geary said in an undertone. "Why should he?" she was asked. "That's what my mother thinks," she replied, lowering her voice still more and looking around her as if she were afraid of being heard by ears other than those she could see. "And why does your mother think so?" "Not so loud. She says the ghost doesn't like to be bothered." "And why does she say that?" Because nothing." This skillfully expressed reticence goaded the dancers' curiosity. They crowded around Meg and begged her to explain herself. Standing there, elbow to elbow, they transmitted their fear to each other and took keen, chilling pleasure in it. "I swore not to tell," Meg whispered. But they continued their urgent pleas and promised secrecy so convincingly that Meg began. "All right. It's because of the box." "What box?" "The ghost's box, here in the opera." "The ghost has a box?" At this idea that the ghost had his own private box, the dancers gasped with amazement and a kind of somber joy. "Oh, tell us about it." "Not so loud," Meg ordered again. "It's box 5. You know, the one next to the stage box in the first left tier." "Really?" "Yes, really. My mother is the usher in charge of it. But you swear you won't tell, don't you?" "Of course." "Well, that's the ghost box. No one has been in it for more than a month. No one but the ghost, that is. And orders have been given that it's never to be rented again." "And it's true that the ghost comes there?" "Yes, it is." "Then someone comes into the box." "The ghost comes into it, but there's no one there." The little dancers looked at one another. If the ghost came into the box, it should be possible to see him. since he wore a black swallow-tailed coat and had a death's head. They said this to Meg, but she answered, "No, it's not possible to see him. He doesn't have a black coat or a head. You've heard about his death's head and his head of fire, but that's all nonsense. He doesn't have anything. He's heard only when he's in the box. My mother has never seen him, but she's heard him. She knows he can't be seen because she's the one who gives him the program." La Sorelli felt it was time for her to intervene. "Meg, you don't really expect us to believe that silly story, do you?" Meg burst into tears. "I should have kept my mouth shut. If my mother ever finds out. But Joseph Bouquet is wrong to stick his nose into things that are none of his business. It will bring him bad luck. My mother said so last night." Just then, they all heard heavy, rapid footsteps in the hall and a breathless voice shouting, "Cecile! Cecile, are you there?" "That's my mother," said little Jammes. "What can be the matter?" She opened the door. A respectable-looking lady burst into the dressing room and sank into an armchair with a groan, her eyes rolling wildly. "It's horrible," she said. "What's horrible?" "Joseph Bouquet. He's what?" "He's dead." The room was filled with exclamations, astonished protests, and frightened requests for explanation. Yes, he was just found in the third cellar, hanged. But the most terrible part of it is that the stagehands who found his body claim that all around it they heard a sound like the singing of the dead. "The ghost did it," cried Meg Geary. The words seemed to have slipped out against her will. She immediately put her fists in front of her mouth. No, I didn't say anything. I didn't say anything." Around her, all her companions were repeating in voices lowered by terror, Yes, it was the ghost." La Sorelli was pale. "Now I'll never be able to give my speech," she said. Little Jammes' mother stated her opinion as she emptied a glass of liqueur that had been left on the table. The ghost must have had something to do with it. The fact is that the way Joseph Bouquet died never became known. The brief investigation gave no result, except for a conclusion of natural suicide. The sinister news quickly spread all over the opera, where Joseph Bouquet had been greatly liked. The dressing room emptied, and the little dancers grouped round La Sorelli like frightened sheep round their shepherd, headed for the lounge, trotting along dimly lighted halls and staircases as fast as their legs could carry them.